fraud, attribution, and transparency in digital marketing. Digital advertising is a massive global industry, but one that faces serious challenges. From fraud that siphons off billions of dollars to persistent difficulties in accurately measuring attribution, to the responsibility platforms bear or should bear for protecting consumers, especially children, in an environment dominated by programmatic ads. We're joined today by an outstanding group of experts who I'll introduce now. To my left, Brian J. Boyle, Deputy Chair of the U.S. Antitrust and Competition Practice at DLA Piper, who advises clients in high-stakes antitrust and consumer protection matters, from litigation and investigations to complex mergers. R.L. Garcia, Chief Operating Officer at Check My Ads, a watchdog organization focused on transparency and accountability in the digital advertising ecosystem. Haley Hinkle, Policy Counsel at Fair Play for Kids, who advocates for stronger protections for children and teens online, with a background in surveillance and civil liberties issues. And Lena Cohen, Staff Technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who works on tools like Privacy Badger and broader issues of surveillance, the data broker industry, and consumer privacy. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And with that, let's dive right in. So to set the table, I'd love to start with a breakdown of how the current digital advertising ecosystem actually works. So we'd love to turn to our resident subject matter expert here, Lena. And I was hoping you could help tackle this and answer, what is programmatic advertising to begin with, and what happens when a consumer is actually visiting a web page and clicks on it and is served a programmatic ad, sort of what goes on behind the scenes there.
Yeah, so programmatic advertising, like the automatic buying and selling of ads, is mostly powered by a system called real-time bidding that is extremely harmful to consumer privacy, but most people have never heard about it. It's the process of auctioning off online ad spaces, and in the process can leak personal data to lots of companies. So the way it works is when you visit an app or a website with ad space, it'll ask an ad tech company to run an auction to fill that ad space. The ad tech company will package all of the information it can gather about you into what's called a bid request, that it then broadcasts to thousands of potential advertisers. And bid requests can include personal information like people's unique advertising IDs, their precise location coordinates, the content they're reading or viewing online, their inferred interests, and more. And so advertisers, or like the ad tech companies that are representing them in this ecosystem, decide whether and how much to bid on ad space, on that ad space, based on the information in bid requests, along with like data profiles they've built about people over time. And the key vulnerability of this system is that even though only one advertiser is going to end up winning the auction and placing an ad, all participants in the auction get to see the data. And so this incentivizes data brokers to pose as advertisers in order to access massive streams of consumer information that flow through the system every day. Like, there are billions of bid requests being sent a day, and you can imagine how that allows data brokers and advertisers to collect consumer data at a staggering scale.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that breakdown. Yeah, I think it's important to know what system we're dealing with here. And so often, ad tech companies might defend programmatic advertising and the mass collection of consumer data on which it relies by saying, well, this is the model that helps keep the internet free. I see that, defense repeated time and again in privacy policies and motions to dismiss class action lawsuits, like you name it. Ariel, as the former chief privacy officer for a major agency, would love to get your perspective on that kind of claim that this is just how the internet functions. So what do you make of that?
So I've always found that argument to be disingenuous and a bit misleading. There is validity to the fact that the traditional value exchange was, I see ads and I get content for free in exchange, right? There, nowhere in that value exchange was this idea of constant, pervasive tracking and unfettered trade in data. That was never part of the bargain. So programmatic fundamentally changed that bargain. Ad-supported content and the idea that behaviorally targeted advertising or RTB are required for the health of the media ecosystem, they're not the same thing. The reality is the way that programmatic advertising works, as Lena alluded to, is that advertisers are not the ones placing their ads, right? Advertisers rely on ad tech companies on the buy side. Publishers rely on ad tech companies on the sell side. And so what you have instead is the siphoning of value to the middle. So quite the opposite. In my view, the current state of programmatic actually harms publishers and harms advertisers. If it were not the case that a lot of that value has been extracted by the middle, then publishers would ultimately be better off.
Got it. Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind like how many middlemen we're talking about engage in just like a single real-time bid. Brian, and as a lawyer, who advises companies in cases related to some of these practices, wanted to turn to you next and get your thoughts. Can programmatic advertising, which has become this, the dominant form of advertising online, can that be done responsibly, especially from a privacy standpoint? Curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe two disclaimers to start. Obviously, I'm of course only speaking for myself here, not my firm or any of my clients. But and the second disclaimer being, since I'm the token defense lawyer here, I'm gonna kind of play that. I'm gonna play that role and maybe be the foil a little bit. But look, I think from a legal perspective, the short answer is yes. I think I think Chair Ferguson's concurrence in Mobile Walla really gives kind of a roadmap for that and how that might be done. And I think probably the most important takeaway from that is that consent is key in this entire realm. And it's basically the principle is sort of as I think about it, it's use data in ways that consumers consented to, and if that can be the focus of the analysis and you can overcome that hurdle, then yes, I think you certainly can do this in a legally compliant way. Of course, the question is sort of from a practical perspective, what does that look like? And I mean, I'll say I have sort of a working mental framework right now for thinking about this that has a couple of parts. It's sort of collection, right, is the first one, and which basically means a la the Mobile Walla case that I just talked about, right? The initial information collection wasn't lawful, right? And disclosures are key. I'm sure we're going to talk more about disclosures later on, I think, but also be considering things like whether what you're doing involves children, right? Whether what you're doing involves location data, right? But fundamentally, is that initial collection lawful? Number two is protection, right? The FTC and state AGs and private plaintiffs are still going to bring kind of core privacy cases, and so is the data protected? Number three rather is analysis. I think the Mobile Walla case suggests that if the data is collected in a legally compliant way, there is a lot of scope for what companies can do to analyze that data and make use of it. And I think that's a place that I expect to see a lot of innovation around. Honestly, all of these things, and to a great degree, to give an optimistic take on this, I think it can be an opportunity. Doing these things can be an opportunity for differentiation. But if you can establish that you're doing these things in the right way, you can be a more attractive business partner. Number four is the output, right? So what do you do with the analysis that you performed? That certainly may separately violate the law, and so you need to be thinking about that in terms of things like COPPA, but also, it's much broader. It's broader than just consumer protection. What are the implications for the outputs of your data for things like surveillance pricing and antitrust issues, for example? And then the last is what do you say about it? What do you tell people? What are the representations that you make to the public about what you're doing? Is that truthful and not deceptive? And if you can kind of think through that mental framework, I think it is certainly possible to do these things in a legally compliant way, but that's not to say that it's easy.
Awesome. Thanks for that overview. And I think before we'll definitely get to things like disclosures, consent notices, COPPA. I did want to pick up real quick on the Mobile Walla FTC case, since for context for those of you that weren't following it, that was the first time the FTC really explicitly said that collecting consumer data from real-time auctions for purposes other than the auction itself that bid was submitted for is an unfair practice, which was potentially this landmark or at least significant decision. So Haley, I wanted to turn to you next, get your opinions on potentially that ruling, its significance, and then maybe more broadly how federal regulators kind of view the ad tech ecosystem right now outside of
Yeah, I'll leave the particulars around the significance of the RTB piece to my co-panelists, because that's a little outside of what I think about at Fair Play. But I think very much we can, as my co-panelist was just saying, look at then Commissioner Ferguson's concurrence in the decision to kind of pick up on some threads and get a sense of where we might see some through lines between the Con FTC and the Ferguson FTC on some of these privacy and data issues. I think if you look at Chair Khan's statement on behalf of all the Democrats and some of the things she was really pulling on in terms of things like sensitivity of location data and what it reveals, you saw a lot of agreement from Commissioner Ferguson. What's interesting is Chair Khan also really goes to the effort to point out that the commission under her leadership really tried to move away from remedies just focused on notice and consent, and really trying to drive a bit more at consumer expectations. And I think there is maybe a bit of an open question about whether at least the FTC is willing to kind of continue on that line. We've certainly seen in speeches and public statements, particularly from Chair Ferguson, Chris Muffarage, who's leading the Bureau of Consumer Protection, expressions about a desire to do what they consider, hewing more closely to sort of the letter of Section 5, and some criticism of some of the ways in which they feel that the last commission, stretched itself. And I will be transparent that my organization was pretty enthusiastic about some of those things under the last commissioner. But yeah, so it's interesting because I think there are, this case represents, an interesting opportunity to look at some of those points of agreement, but certainly, I think we can expect that the commission under this administration is going to be a bit more limited in how it approaches the issue.
Awesome. Did anyone else want to add anything on Mobile Walla? Good. Yeah.
I just want to add a little bit more context about the Mobile Walla case and how it demonstrates the harms of real-time bidding. Mobile Walla is a location data broker that for a period of time collected about 60% of the precise location data it had about millions of Americans from these real-time bidding auctions, and it sold that data to track union organizers, to track protesters. It's a great example of why it's dangerous to broadcast massive amounts of consumer data through non-transparent and sort of unaccountable advertising ecosystems.
Awesome. Thanks, Lena.
Maybe just real quick to just connect two threads. I think one last observation from Chair Ferguson's concurrence in that case, but also from sort of other comments that we've heard out of the current FTC that I think tie back to your question before about can this be done, right? There is, I think, Chair Ferguson and others have been explicit about wanting to be careful not, in the pursuit of consumer protection, in the pursuit of their competition mission as well, to also not unduly squelch innovation. And I think in this realm, it seems that the principal way that they think about that is, again, sort of the analysis part of the equation and preserving an ability for these companies to do creative and innovative things in the way that they analyze the data. But then, of course, all of that is premised on the notion that that the data was collected in a legally compliant way in the first place. And I think that that's, as we kind of look forward and as companies think about how they can operate in this space. It's an important framing to keep in mind.
Yeah.
I'll just add one thing from like a practical perspective. With Mobile Walla, with Xmode, with the whole kind of line around sensitive personal data and cross-site browsing being considered per se sensitive, you would have expected perhaps some at least public dialogue about it in the industry, and that simply did not happen. With this current FTC, what I'm observing is a lot of the trade associations kind of showboating about it, and taking every opportunity to get tidbits from the current FTC around how surveillance advertising wasn't fair to the industry, and they're being very I don't know if optimistic is the right term. I think the important thing to remember is that in this example, again, as Lena spoke to, this is just as equally a risk to national security, right? There are other risks to children that are common, persistent bipartisan priorities, and so I do think that the industry is over-indexing a bit.
Got it. I guess shifting gears for a moment to another major issue facing the industry right now, which is ad fraud, especially in programmatic advertising. So some research has suggested that as much as $84 billion in global ad spend is lost to fraud annually, which would make ad fraud second only to the drug trade as a source of revenue for organized crime, which is a pretty mind-boggling statistic to me. But Ariel, again, speaking from the ex-industry perspective, why is ad fraud so profitable, and what are the most common forms it takes today?
Yeah, so in terms of why it's profitable and I guess prevalent, it goes back to the model, right? So you have this complex supply chain of intermediaries, but let's talk about the incentives within that system. Most of these companies in the middle, so the tools that advertisers use, the tools that publishers use, and the agencies that are the ones that are actually running campaign for advertisers, those entities are paid on a percentage of spend. So as long as the money is clearing through their pipes, that they are happy, right? The more money that passes through their pipes also usually comes with more data, and that's what matters to them. There's very little incentive to do anything to truly prevent fraud. In fact, you have like a sub-industry, a sub-sector of third-party verification companies that have made a model out of saying that they are preventing and detecting fraud, but they too are paid on volume and don't really have an incentive to prevent or detect it. So that creates a situation where the incentive is not there. There's a ton of information asymmetry. Ad tech is an incredibly opaque and complex system, and so that's why it's so profitable, right? If you think about the ad tech market and the flow here, it looks very similar to a financial market, right? Buyers on one side, sellers on the other side, and yet in financial markets there are real regulations, right? Like there are real requirements. There are things like know your customer rules and anti-money laundering provisions. That doesn't exist in this marketplace. So it's kind of carte blanche for anyone that wants to engage in fraud. Common types of fraud, I have kind of two separate tracks to that answer. So the thing that everyone thinks of is bots, right? But like bots that are ads that are shown to bots instead of real people. That's probably the most common example. There are also things like domain spoofing, which let's say an advertiser thinks that they're running on a really good premium website, but instead it's a fraudster that's pretending to be a premium website. And then there's more complicated types of fraud like attribution fraud, and what that's about is basically manipulating the tracking of an ad to falsely claim credit for the results that it drove, right? So making it seem like because someone saw an ad, they ended up installing an app or making a purchase, but that's not actually what happened. The thing is that those it's fun to talk about the sophisticated types of ad fraud, but the reality is that the industry has done very, very little in terms of truly curbing even the most simple common types of fraud because of the incentive issues that I mentioned earlier, and the way that industry standards are written because of all of this is a lot of so if we think about what fraud's supposed to be, it's like if someone thinks that they're getting one thing but they get another thing, that's not that would be fraud. The way that ad fraud is, it's like made up definitions. So the bot thing is invalid traffic, and there's general invalid traffic, and there's sophisticated invalid traffic, and not all of it is qualified as ad fraud. And what that means is that $84 billion is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to actual advertiser waste, where they are paying for something and getting something else, or are paying for ineffective solutions in the middle. And the knock-on effect of that is that any of that money that advertisers are wasting is also money that's not getting to the publisher.
Right. Yeah, I think we've all been there when we're on a mobile app or game trying to exit out of ad, and it redirects us to the app store. And while that might annoy us in the moment, we might not be thinking about how that's actually contributing to performance metrics on the back end there, tied to billions of dollars in ad spend. I guess I'll open up the floor a little more if anyone wanted to add anything else there, or speak to other common dark patterns along those lines.
Just that it's interesting to hear about how opaque this ecosystem is from the advertiser perspective, because I often think about it from the consumer perspective, and I think it shows that the system is really not compatible with informed consent for consumers. If even advertisers have a difficult time seeing how data and money is flowing through the system.
Got it. On that note of opaqueness, I'll reference another report here done by digital media research firm Analytics from earlier this year on how some global brands might have been inadvertently funding child sexual abuse material online through ad spend. So I'd love to ask, how is that even possible that ads from vendors like Amazon, Google, Quantcast were being served on these explicit, extremely disturbing sites? So Haley, maybe I'll pose that to you first from Fair Play.
Yeah. I mean, I think everything Ariel just said really speaks to, the words opacity and complexity really stood out to me of the system. That report was, like many things in sort of this area, shocking but not surprising. A couple years ago, we actually elevated another Analytics report to the FTC, which showed YouTube running ads on content that was designated as made for kids, and therefore, according to the way YouTube does COPPA compliance, they don't collect verifiable parental consent. They just on content they consider falling within COPPA's purview, say they don't do targeted advertising on it. Analytics found evidence that really did not seem to be the case, and we shared that with the FTC as part of their ongoing enforcement over YouTube on these issues. But my takeaway from this, and I'm interested, if others have things they want to add, is just that there's so much that, first of all, you've got some big actors holding a lot of the cards at the end of the day, and there's so much that advertisers don't understand or are unable, and by advertisers I mean the people buying ads that want their product or their whatever it may be to be elevated on content online, don't understand and can't really control in some ways where these things are going, and so they don't even know a lot of times that they're running headfirst into COPPA non-compliant advertising issues.
I have so much to say. So in the case of the CSAM report, we worked with Fair Play and closely with Senators Blackburn and Blumenthal on letters that they ended up sending to Google, Amazon, who else was there? Double Verify and Integral Ad Science. I mentioned third-party verification companies that are supposed to be making sure bad stuff doesn't happen. That's what they do. And 2 trade associations or standard-setting orgs, TAG and MRC. So why do I highlight that? There are so many points of failure that allowed this to happen. There is a failure at every single step of the supply chain, and it all comes back to the incentive. The agencies that run ad campaigns for advertisers, to the extent that they have data on where the ads ran, should be looking at them. We're not talking about a website that hosted CSAM that was not known. It was on the NCMEC list for several years.
Since 2021,
right? So you want to talk about sophisticated fraud and problems like that. We're talking about looking at a list of websites, of entities, putting a .com after them so that they look like a domain, and then blocking them. This is not difficult. This was simply not done by the agencies. It was not done by the vendors that were monetizing the website, right? It was not caught by the third-party verification firms who literally exist to prevent things like this from happening. And so how do you solve it? Again, I mentioned know your customer diligence before. It seems like a fairly reasonable requirement to have to review a NCMEC list and make sure that you're not monetizing those entities. But there are more technical solutions too. Like this site was set to no index, meaning it wouldn't show up in Google search results. I promise you most brands won't find great things on websites that don't want to show up in search results. This is not like a huge complicated concept, right? So, know your customer requirements are very important, as is mitigating conflicts of interest. Until you resolve the fact that the agencies that are working for the advertisers don't have an incentive to do this either, you're going to keep having issues like this happen, and it's where strong antitrust enforcement comes in, right? Like I've been covering the Google ad tech remedies trial, and my brain is just very much still there right now. But working for both sides of the market is going to continue to result in these types of problems. I'll save my comments on the Made for Kids thing for later, but I have thoughts on that too.
I guess one quick follow-up, Ariella, is you were telling me earlier that the average programmatic ad runs on how many websites? Like
44,000 websites.
Yeah.
So when you think about advertisers, I totally get it from so I am civil society now, but I was in industry for 10 years, right? From civil society's perspective, it's very easy to say oh, well, it's the advertiser's money. Advertisers, you reminded me of a point. They don't actually have this data. Most advertisers cannot get access to their own log level data. One of the things that we advocated for as a result of the CSAM campaign is because advertisers couldn't get the actual page level URL on where their ads ran, they quite simply would have had no idea, right? So they are not even able to properly steward their campaigns.
And Brian, I wanted to get your thoughts on this too, just this question of liability if, as Ariel says, an advertiser or brand isn't even aware of the URL that an ad is running on, and potentially thousands of cases in these huge campaigns. It seems like there might be a lot of finger pointing behind the scenes, but what are your thoughts on liability in instances like this?
Yeah, I mean, look, when it comes to liability, obviously you have to look at every situation individually, but I think a number of the concepts that you've heard over the past couple of minutes are really key there. How opaque the market is, the lack of data access that advertisers have, and frankly, I mean, this has been referred to, but I think just to put a fine point on it, the incredible scale of this, even if you're a big business, makes it very difficult to manage. And so I'm very sympathetic to the advertisers in these situations, many of whom, frankly, from my perspective, when you talk about incentives, I mean, many of them, frankly, from my perspective, have very strong, not only very strong incentives, but very strong, sincerely held feelings that they don't want this to be happening. They don't want their brands associated with these things. They don't want the loss of brand value that could come from this sort of thing. So I'm quite sympathetic to them in these situations.
Yeah. Looking at other potential challenge here, just an issue of stealth advertising, and an issue that's kind of on the cusp of potentially being legislated, but we have a lot of questions. Oftentimes children under 13, teens don't even know that they're looking at advertisements, be that online, embedded in games, etc. Haley, I know this is a focus area of Fair Plays, but would love to hear from you about stealth advertising, some common examples, how has it evolved?
Yeah, so I would put a lot of things into the bucket of stealth advertising. I would put pretty much all influencer content in there. Freemium games, meaning games that are free to download, but then there are opportunities for microtransactions once you start playing. Sponsored experiences in video games, something we see in Roblox, for example, all examples of stealth advertising. The reason I say that bucket is so big is because if we peel way back to the FCC's rules about advertising to children via television, there's some very clear guidelines and guardrails about separating the entertainment content from the advertising, rules around the timing and how you're delineating the separation of the program and the ad, rules against host selling, so you can't have SpongeBob in an ad immediately in an ad break, selling popsicles, whatever, what have you, to kids watching SpongeBob, right, because of the confusion that would create. Rules around no program length commercials. There is a lot of program length sponsored content, video content online. I mean, right, like you can get a toy review 25 minutes long. It's just entirely an advertisement. And rules around product placements. We are unfortunately quite far from those types of limitations on the internet. And that's something that Fair Play has been telling the FTC for a very long time. They think about this in sort of the framework of disclosures. And there are, a lot of reasons that the existing guidelines are not sufficient, and also a ton of violations of the existing guidelines. As a person on Instagram, pretty much every time I open the app, I see someone violating the guidelines around how you're supposed to designate paid content. It's a huge issue for kids. There's a lot they can't understand about disclosures. There's a lot of research about the ways in which, especially because this is happening through influencers and familiar characters, their sort of cognitive defenses against advertising, meaning just sort of the opportunity to recognize something as an ad and think about whether you want to be influenced or not, just aren't sparked by the way this is happening. And so that's a huge issue. And it's a multi-billion dollar industry. And it's not hard to find the industry reports really sort of touting how much kids are influencing household spend, and the fact that a lot of what marketers want to do is get to those kids via, these online opportunities, whether it's long-form video, whether it's social media, gaming opportunities, the in-game experiences. And so it's a huge issue, and one that we've kind of become accustomed to, but in reality is pretty far from what we used to say was really sort of acceptable for blurring these lines.
Yeah, it seems like the practices have just evolved so much faster than the regulations have been able to keep pace. But Brian, I wanted to ask you in this space, when talking to brands, like, what the line is like when it comes to stealth advertising, what kind of disclosures should responsible advertisers be putting out there? I know it might not be a fine line, but I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, look, I think I'd say a couple of things. I mean, the first is that the law has been clear for a really long time that disclosures are not a cure-all, right? So as a starting point, I think anytime you're going to have a discussion about disclosures in this context or in pretty much any other, you have to kind of appropriately situate that in the legal framework, right? So there are decades and decades of FTC case law and other case law that say, when the FTC is analyzing whether an ad is deceptive, they look at the net impression of the ad, okay? And disclosures might qualify what's otherwise in the ad or might clarify it, for example, but again, it's sort of like core law school type material that you can't, the disclosure can't be used to to contradict, for example, like the main claims in the ad. And I think that's really important in this context too, that when you're thinking about this, you're sort of thinking about it backwards. If you start with what disclosures are needed, I think the better framing is, what do we have to do to make the net impression of our ad, not deceptive, truthful and not deceptive? Perhaps a piece of that answer is disclosures. Then, with sort of that established, I think, the law is also clear that, particularly when we're talking about advertising to children, right, that advertising to children is viewed, and specifically when we're talking about what's deceptive, is viewed in terms of a audience of children, right? We've lots and lots of case law talking about that when an ad is directed to a particular audience, right, it's evaluated in terms of the way that that audience, that a reasonable member of that group or that audience would perceive it. And so when it comes to disclosures and sort of when it comes to the rest of the framing of the ad, I think you have to think about it that way. I think the other thing that I would say, just sort of on a personal level, and if you zoom out a little bit, disclosures are really important, and I think they can be done really well. But one thing that they really generally don't help with is they don't help parents. So a kid viewing an ad might see a disclosure, and there's the question that I think you posed, which is what's the compliant way to or how can you have effective disclosures? But they don't help parents, right? And so I think an really important part of this discussion is making sure the parents have appropriate tools, and I say that as a parent, and and with a lot of humility. It's very hard, but like a key, I think the only way that you really solve these challenges ultimately is you have to empower parents, and and frankly, parents have a lot of responsibility to talk to kids about the way they engage with stuff. It was even when we were all growing up, like all of our parents, I'm sure, told us don't pay attention to the ads on Saturday morning cartoons that are trying to sell you, sugary cereals and whatever. And those conversations are a lot more complicated now, but they're still really important. So the bottom line from my perspective is it can 100% be done, right? But if at the end of the day the net effect of your ad is essentially that it's an undisclosed endorsement under the FTC guidelines, because the perception of somebody in the audience is that it's going to be someone other than the sponsoring advertiser conveying their opinions, then you have to make sure that that is clear through a combination of disclosures and just sort of other changes that you might make to the presentation of the content. And lastly, I will say, I do think, just to throw out the optimistic point here, I do think there are a ton of good actors out there that are thinking about this stuff and genuinely trying not to deceive people. And it absolutely can be done, but it takes this sort of holistic approach.
Yeah, well, on that subject of empowering parents, I know the previous panels talked a lot about how there's, still no comprehensive federal data privacy legislation. Doesn't seem like there will be anytime soon, but, this year we did get the first update to the Children's Online Privacy Rule since 2013, which now requires separate verifiable parental consent to share children's data with advertisers and other third parties. So, maybe Haley, starting with you, how might that impact the online ad space?
Yeah, I think that we are looking at that update with great interest. COPPA only protects kids under the age of 13, and I spent a lot of time really trying to get Congress to expand those protections in a lot of different ways. But, to the extent that this rule update presents an opportunity with the FTC saying, no, you really need to be very explicit in providing both the notice and obtaining the consent around third-party sharing. In theory, this gives families an opportunity to, allow a child to use a platform while being able to say no to some of those other third-party disclosures. I think it's going to take some time here to see the extent to which the platforms are really actually complying with that and doing these separate consent processes. It may take a little bit here. I think sometimes, as was discussed in the previous panel, and as we see in FTC world, some of these things are considered a little bit the cost of doing business for some actors, and kind of playing on the edge case until somebody ends up nailed is certainly something that we contend with. I think there's also some interesting pieces there because the FTC, in response to some comments from Fairplay and our colleagues at the Center for Digital Democracy, did spend some time in the rule explaining their intent with this, that this should cover all kinds of modern practices that may not be thought of as quote unquote third party in those terms in the industry, but things like data clean rooms and other sort of collaborative opportunities to share data, should be captured. And so I think that's critical and really important. And, talk about like opacity in a very, a system that's sort of very unknown to a lot of consumers. So it's going to be interesting, but hopeful at the opportunity to sort of stem the flow of some of that, of kids' information.
Thank you. Yeah, and then in the time we have left,
I just had one
Yeah.
very quick thing on that. I leave it to the rest of you to talk about the industry implications, but there will be enforcement. Like, it's coming. Like I sometimes say to companies, like, there will be lawyers. The FTC is really consistent about, like, saying what it's going to do and then showing you what it's going to do and then going out and doing it. there are new requirements, they have new authorities, they're going to use it. And so I think anybody in the ad tech stack that is potentially subject to these rules, should be taking this very, very seriously and understand that they're going to bring cases based on this.
and I guess not just the FTC, but state AGs
For
can
sure.
also enforce copy. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll bring the skeptic's practical perspective here. Until there is an actual knowledge standard, the biggest actors that we are all hoping stop doing bad things will not stop. They are very, very good at finding loopholes and making definitions just as they need to be. I mentioned that I'm covering the Google Ad Tech antitrust remedies trial. That was a mouthful right now. Google has had now 2 employees say that Google does not use Google's first-party data to target ads on open web display online. I was in the rooms when I saw their entire value prop is that they do that. My best guess is that it's the way that they are defining targeted, because it's personalization when they do it. My other guess is that first-party data is defined as data generated from the use of their O&O products, and they're saying that it's data derived from the data that's generated from the use of their O&O products. This is impossible to enforce against if they have the intent to circumvent it. So my caveat in all of this is having publishers I'm not really worried about, right? They're not the mixed audience loophole. You don't really see publishers trying to avail themselves of it. The platforms, there would have to be a concerted effort to say that the loopholes are not going to work anymore, and I'm nervous that will take forever to bear itself out.
Yeah, I guess the other major caveat with COPPA then there is it also only applies to children under 13, and we're starting to see some states try to change that. The Maryland Online Data Privacy Act was already brought up. That just blanket bans targeted advertising to individuals under 18. Curious, Haley or anyone else, if you had thoughts on states starting to shift or at least try to expand COPPA protections to children over the age of 13.
Yeah, I might caution state lawmakers against calling it an expansion of COPPA and running into issues with preemption in court. So maybe not that way exactly. But yeah, I think we could anticipate to see other states take on the issue of targeted advertising for kids. I think we've seen a lot of activity around these issues in states like Vermont and New York and Utah and California. But overall, it's banning targeted advertising to minors is a very politically popular policy piece. It's really not one where you get a lot of pushback, whether it's federally or in the states. It's a matter of is it on a vehicle that can pass? I think we've got lawmakers across the political spectrum that understand the ways in which the drive for kids' data is feeding a lot of other parts of the online experience for kids that are undesirable, and that if we can pull that out, we might see the ecosystem, reframe itself a bit for children. And so certainly think that's popular, and it just needs to get on the right vehicles.
Got it. Awesome. Well, I want to ask one more question, then I'll open it up or see if the audience had anything else to add. But for Lena, browser settings like global privacy control, these are talked about as other solutions to potentially put more autonomy in the hands of consumers when it comes to, exercising their privacy rights in the ad space. So was wondering if you could talk about what GPC is, and then of course Privacy Badger, which is EFF's kind of own version of this.
Yeah, GPC is a signal that people can send websites to opt themselves out of data sharing and selling, and the idea is that users should be able to turn on a browser setting or install an extension that automatically sends this signal to all websites to make opting out easier than like navigating dark patterns to find the opt-out button on every single website they visit. And what's important is that several states have made the GPC signal legally binding in their privacy laws. There's plenty of research showing that a lot of websites still don't respect GPC opt-out signals, and so the free browser extension I developed for EFF, Privacy Badger, doesn't just send the GPC signal, but it also enforces it. It stops websites from loading trackers that aren't respecting this opt-out signal. I think that makes it, it's important for consumers to have tools to protect themselves from the harms of targeted advertising if lawmakers aren't going to do it. But one more thing I want to say about the GPC signal is that it is not, it is technically possible that mobile operating systems could add a setting for the GPC signal, and so that people could easily send this opt-out signal to apps. And the California bill that requires browsers to all support this GPC setting used to require mobile operating systems to support the same setting. And the fact that that was removed, I think just points to like a bigger issue and gap in enforcement against like tracking and targeting on mobile apps. Like it's easier to go after to detect and go after privacy violations on websites, but consumers are just as much, if not more, harmed by the same privacy violations on mobile apps.
I guess I'll personally plug Privacy Badger since if it's free to install and it'll show you how many third-party pixels are trying to access your information at the top of your browser when you visit a different site, and like in some cases it might be 1 or 2. I think my record is like I had a site try to put 53 ad pixels on me, so it's like can really help you understand the scale there. Great. Well, I want to pause and see if we had any audience questions, and then wrap.
Yeah, I just had a question for all of this. I'm wondering with the legislation that we're seeing currently in effect, why it hasn't had any impact on Meta if they are not able to target to children?
Oh, they're able to target to children. There's nothing that currently stops them, really. I mean, I think the FTC with the rule change, with the COPPA rule change, is saying you need to get another consent, but the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act is a notice and consent framework. If you provide the notice to parents and get their verifiable consent, there are limits in the sense of things around like data retention and some purpose specification in COPPA, but none of that really limits against you getting consent for targeted advertising, and so there's actually very little federally, and as Ethan pointed out, we're starting to see some activity in the states.
Do you expect the state, are there loopholes at the state level that it's not really going to impact their business model, or do you expect there to be a big hit pretty soon now that we're seeing at the state level the ban on targeting ads on kids? Or am I misunderstanding that it's not actually a ban?
No, that's an interesting question. Do you have thoughts?
Okay, so at the same time, these platforms are pushing their AI targeting products, and all of the opacity that we had before is now one big further layer obfuscated, right? So I don't anticipate a tremendous effect. We can't get Google to say they're using their data to target. So like we can't agree on what qualifies as targeting. I think until there's enforcement to press on any of these issues, nothing's going to change, right?
we have any other questions?
Well, I just, Judge Mehta, same pronunciation, went easy on Google in the remedies phase because of AI. And the question popped up in the start of this presentation, do you think this might happen in the ad tech case? As your conversation continued, the question dropped in my mind in relevance, but I thought I'd still ask it.
Will Judge Brinkema go easy on?
Is it possible because we have this new? But I mean, it's very different when you're dealing with children. It's
Yeah,
not-
no, but so the reality is the impact, and right now I'll speak to my perspective because I don't have time to talk about all that's been happening around AI jazz hands in the case. But the reality is that the way that AI disrupted the search market is fundamentally different from the impact of AI on the ad exchange and ad server markets, which is what we're looking at, right?
That's what I absorbed.
Yeah.
Absorbed is-
And the reality of it is, like, there is no big innovative disruption in ad servers. There are no other ad servers, you know? So I don't think that AI will be as much of a factor here.
Right. What else? Well, I guess I would just pose maybe a wrap-up question for all of you. You know, what direction do you think programmatic is headed? You know, what could drive us towards potentially more transparency? Will it be, you know, private litigation, mix of state laws, any federal, hope at the federal level? But yeah, if we wanted to work our way down, or just any final thoughts.
Yeah, start us off.
Sure. I would say a few things. We need to enforce the privacy laws that we do have. I know, like, every panel today has talked about the fact that the notice and consent model is broken, but it's what we have in a lot of states, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. I think the fact that privacy laws are under-enforced points also to the need for privacy laws to have a private right of action that allows anyone whose privacy rights are violated to hold companies accountable, not just government agencies. And this might be even less realistic, but just as important. I think that the harms of targeted advertising based on people's online behavior are so severe that I think that if we really want to see change, we need to ban this privacy invasive form of ad targeting, because otherwise companies like Meta and all of these ad tech companies are so financially motivated to harvest as much data as they can about people that they will continue finding creative ways around legal and technical privacy protections that we put up. Like, that is the root cause of so many of the issues we're talking about today. And I don't think we will be able to stop so many of these harms unless we change that massive financial incentive to track, profile, and target consumers of all ages, not just kids.
Thanks. Yeah, Haley, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of where things are headed in terms of the technological capability, AI is going to deeply complicate this issue for kids, really worsen everything we're already seeing, the level of sophistication in targeting, but also the fact that kids are deeply, deeply trusting, and as I said, develop those, parasocial relationship type attachments, and we're seeing it with chatbots, bots that are imitate characters or a virtual friend of some kind. So on the one hand, you're going to have kids, providing even more sort of intimate information to these companies, and then on the other, very, very, sophisticated, stealthy, personalized ways of then turning that back around to them and trying to market things. And I mean, we already see it. If you talk to Alexa about being bored, she will pretty frequently shouldn't even say she. I shouldn't give her a human pronoun like that. But the technology will market to the child. Will mention products at times, and so it's all the more reason that we really need to think very carefully and move towards meaningful regulation, really ideally federally, because the technology has already outpaced sort of what parents can keep up with and what kids can understand, and it's only going to get more intense from here.
So I'll end on an oddly optimistic note, and it's not going to sound optimistic, but it is. So we've talked about how invasive the tracking and targeting practices are, but the beautiful thing about it is that the data that results from that's used for targeting is very bad. It's very inaccurate. So I accessed my data profile from one of the very few ad tech companies that tells you what audience segments you're in, right? So an audience segment is people that like shoes, whatever. They thought that I have kids. I don't, but they also thought that I don't have kids, and my kids were of all ages. They thought that I worked in agriculture, that I'm a defense contractor, that I love and hate my job at the same time, and that I am high income while being below the poverty threshold. And so
It's not the lie.
yeah, I mean, right? And this is the data that marketers are paying a premium for. Instead of that money reaching the publisher, it's going to fund this. Now, we talked about earlier the fact that advertisers like consumers they don't realize this. There's no way. How do you validate that the person you reached is actually the person you were trying to reach as part of one of these segments, right? It doesn't exist. So in my view, educating advertisers, getting at following the money and educating advertisers on how much they're actually wasting is a huge area of opportunity. And so I am hopeful that programmatic advertising can get to a better place, because advertisers have no interest in paying a premium for garbage data to end up on 44,000 AI-generated spam sites.
Last but not least.
I'm probably not smart enough to know how it's going to change, but I think my overarching observation would be that it's going to change. And I think it's going to change dramatically, because fundamentally, this is not, the state of the technology and of the industry is in nothing resembling sort of a stable equilibrium, right? It as the point has been made, it doesn't adequately serve many of the stakeholders that are directly involved from an economic standpoint, to say nothing of consumers. And so I do think that, just from personal observation, I think there is a fair amount of advertiser dissatisfaction with the way that with sort of the current state of the world, and that will exert pressure on this. I also think that sort of regardless of, I'll censor myself for making comments about the likelihood of legislation, but even in the absence of any legislation, I think enforcement's going to play an important role here. That's not just me saying that because I defend people in enforcement cases, and that's good for business, but I mean that sincerely. I think although there's, of course, differences that we've talked about in the way that some of the current FTC commissioners think about these issues at the margins from the way it was maybe thought about in the past, they are deeply, deeply concerned, clearly, especially with children's privacy. They've been very clear about that. There's going to be a lot more enforcement on these issues. We can't forget about the state AGs. Right? The state AGs have a tremendous amount of power. It's been observed that this is a bipartisan issue. Many of the state AGs, I think, may even be inclined to share some of the perspective on this of the prior commissioners, right? And so we may see different approaches to these same issues. And then I heard a panelist, I'm not sure if she's still here, but the speaker on one of the prior panels said of plaintiffs' lawyers, basically when there's a will, there's a way. Absolutely true. And so all of these forces are going to come to bear in a significant way, and it just seems inevitable to me as a result of that there's going to be evolution.
Awesome. And thank you all so much for joining us. I enjoyed the talk.